Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate your time and efforts in learning about this subject. Today, we're going to be talking about autism and substance use disorders by prevention educator Ruth Delpino. So I always start off my presentations with two particular slides. One, who I am, and hello everyone. My name is Ruth Delpino. I'm a prevention educator at the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I am the Mercer County Grant Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified in teaching English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. So I also always start off my presentations with these. Why this presentation? This is not to scare you, first of all. This is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've probably known them longer than they know themselves. And I also want to say that this is also not a parenting class in that only parents are allowed to interact with this information. Anybody that works with youth, anybody that engages with youth in some capacity are welcome to be here and are welcome to learn this information and ask questions. Also, my perspective is shaped by my approach and my learning experiences. So that means as a prevention educator, as an educator in the field of prevention, whatever I look at, whatever I come across, those are the sorts of information that I put into my presentations, and they are informed by a lot of those. Also, this is evidence-informed and evidence-based, meaning that the evidence and the studies that I find and all the scientific and empirical research that I do is incorporated into these presentations, but it is formed through the information that I presented as. So if you are looking through some materials and you either disagree or want to learn more about it, I also list those resources in the description as well as at the end of the presentation in the video. So if you are looking for anything to learn more about or are actually wondering on different ways to dispute or add to the discourse, that is also part of that as well. Some evidence-based, meaning I pull a lot from my evidence-based resources, meaning Life Skills and Too Good for Drugs. So those are the sorts of things that we're working with here. Here we go. I also have some disclaimers because we are talking about autism today. And I do want to say that this is something that is new. It's something exciting to learn about, but I am not an expert on autism spectrum disorder. That is not my field of expertise. I am a prevention educator, but we are talking about a lot of things about substance use disorder and its interaction with autism. So we're not going to be talking specifically about autism today. And I am not here to debate on whether or not autism exists. It does exist, and it is something that is real and scientific and empirical. The resources I provide are not an exhaustive list, but what they do talk about are the interactions with substance use disorder and autism. So we want to make sure that we're looking at a lot of beginner materials in case anybody's introduced to this concept. But also I have a lot of resources just in general on autistic populations and substance use disorder and all of those other mitigating resources. I also have consulted many different people on the autism spectrum, and all have advised me that the representation of autism is a spectrum, and every person is different and every experience is different. So they have different beliefs and different ways of interacting with their environment and their world. And that does not mean one existence is better or, more higher than thou than the other. But I just want to let you know that autism is a spectrum and experiences are different. And that is like anything else that is true. This is also about management of substance use disorder and autism, not a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. There are also quick mentions of abuse. It'll really only be 1 or 2 minutes of covering this material, but I do want to get that out of the way. Also, this is for adults who interact with children, meaning professional, personal, or otherwise, meaning that if you have a neighbor who happens to be autistic, if you have someone you come across in the grocery store who happens to be autistic, if you work with children that are autistic, these are all the sorts of things that you can use and you can utilize while you're navigating through their world. Okay. So I also am going to be talking about an overview of autism just because I really want to get that out of the way, just so we can have a basis of understanding of what that means. So we're going to be, and also a lot of these like materials and the ways that I talk about autism in defining it can come across sometimes as infantilizing. And I do want to say that I am not here to infantilize with the disorder because it does not serve the community to do so. Autism is a spectrum, and therefore we will look at it that way, that there are people that are fully autonomous and there are people that can always make their own decisions and people that may need assistance in certain areas. But that does not mean that these people are not aware of anything, and we want to respectfully go through this and understand what that means. So some signs and symptoms of autism spectrum disorder really do include people who have difficulty with social communication, interaction, restricted interests, and repetitive behaviors. So some examples of these types of behaviors are seen with people diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but not all people with autism will show all these behaviors, but some will show several. Also, it does interact differently with people who may have other neurodivergent, which we will define later, neurodivergent conditions such as anxiety, depression, autism, ADHD, ADD, things like that. So a lot of the time people with autism may have difficulty with social communication. So this also just is in general about interaction behaviors. So they may make little or inconsistent eye contact. So they may not have difficulty looking at the person in the eyes. They tend not to look or listen to people. They rarely share enjoyment of objects or activities by pointing or showing others. So this is something that deals with the social interaction where they may really enjoy something, but they may not know how to express exactly how to show their enjoyment to others. And there may be different ways they do that, which we will list later. They also maybe fail to or maybe slow at responding to their names or people trying to verbally interact with them. They may have difficulties with back and forth everyday conversation, and that's normal. For some people, small talk is not always my thing either. They also may often talk at length about a favorite subject without noticing that certain people are interested or without giving others a chance to respond. I actually really like seeing people be passionate about what they like. If they're telling me about their favorite subject, I get really excited about it because I have one friend who loves talking about butterflies, and I can go to this person if I want to learn anything about butterflies, and seeing them be really excited about talking about it, engaging with them in that way is truly a gift because you learn so much. You learn so much information about the research, the enthrallment, the excitement of having something that is their favorite. So that actually is something that I think is very enjoyable. They also may have excuse me, facial expressions, movements, and gestures that do not match what is being said. So in terms of emotions and facial expressions, emotions and circumstance, those are all the sorts of things that they could be interacting with, but they may not be consistent in the way that they express them. So they could be happy but smiling, they could be angry but laughing. These are the sorts of things that, they don't necessarily know how to, or may not have the they interacting with their environment can be inconsistent in that way. They also may have trouble understanding another person's point of view or predict other people's actions, but that doesn't mean they lack empathy at all. And I want to make that very clear. So when a lot of people say not understanding another person's point of view, that doesn't mean they're not trying to understand empathy and have those sorts of interactions as well. We also will be talking about restrictive or repetitive behaviors, and these actually may include certain behaviors or including something called echolalia. And I find it really fascinating. And when I learned about this, I was like really excited to share because echolalia is actually used as can sometimes be used as a coping mechanism, allowing an autistic person to contribute to a conversation when they are unable to contribute in a different way. And actually, it's a coping mechanism because there may be times where they received positive feedback about something that they had said, or that they had received feedback that was really good because of, the timing of that conversation. So they may be saying it because it's their effort in trying to insert themselves in the conversation and be welcoming with that social interaction. So I find that really cool and fascinating. They also may have a lasting, intense interest in certain topics, numbers, and details. They also could be hyper-focused and focused mainly on a few parts or parts of objects. And this may interact with their brains differently, but they are seeing the world in an interesting way, and they may notice details that we don't. Also, they may get upset by slight changes in routine. I know myself, just in general, in changes in routine, it can be upsetting. So people that really focus on routine, it could be really upsetting for them to not have the same things over and over again. They also are more sensitive to sensory input, light, noise, clothing, temperature, things like that. That can also lead to overstimulation, which we will talk about later. People with autism spectrum disorder also may experience sleeping problems and irritability. They may face challenges, but there are really exciting parts to their views as well. They may be able to learn things in detail and remember information for a very long time, meaning because of their hyperfixation, because they are able to focus on certain parts, they can have those interactions definitions and be really good at knowing a lot about a subject. They are also strong visual and auditory learners. So when we are interacting with autistic populations, it could be really great to have a lot of visual representation and a lot of moving parts so that they can be really interested in that. Also, they can be excellent in math, science, music, or art, anything that helps them express themselves. I also will be talking about, when we're talking about autism, it's really important to focus on the fact that autistic populations and people who are neurotypical, um, it's important to know that we don't define people as the things that they lack rather than the things that they actually have. So when we are talking about things that we lack, that's not necessarily conducive to learning about our inner wealth. And so when we were talking about autistic populations, we want to make sure that we are talking about things that they have, that they really contribute, that they are really good at, and focus less on the things that they are not able to do, and vice versa when we're talking about ourselves as well. It's just common courtesy. Also, we may hear this a lot, and I will be using this term back and forth, neurodivergent, and I'm just going to read the meaning here really quickly and the definition. So this is differing in mental or neurological function from what is considered typical or normal. This is frequently used with reference to autism spectrum disorder, also meaning not neurotypical. And this just basically means anyone that has like a sort of difference when they're talking and navigating their environment. And neurodivergent really just means not necessarily typical in the way that they interact with their environment as somebody else would. But neurotypical or neurodivergent can also mean anybody who has a mental health disorder, anyone that has a substance use disorder, things like that. So neurodivergent really just means outside of the normal of what normal brain interaction would be. And also, I do have a visual here. So it talks about a spectrum. This ranges from like functioning, information processing, verbal and nonverbal communication. So I thought that was a great visual for that as well. I do want to talk about autism and internet addiction just because it is something that can be pervasive in the autistic community. So why can this be? There was a study that was done and it is very comprehensive, a lot of pages to sift through, but it is really good to know because there were a lot of statistics there that I found that could be really helpful in understanding why the autism population could really be sort of interacting with the internet and its addiction to it in that way. And what they had really found was that a lot of people who have autism really like repetitive behavior. They like things that are predictable. They like things that are controlled. And if they are interacting with something that is repetitive, that creates an environment where they're able to function and be in charge of their own things, that can be very helpful. But what they had also found is that people that had addiction with the internet also tended to have higher anxiety in a person. So the more likely they were to turn to the internet and the reliance of it. And this is very similar to autistic populations who have depression as well. So it's not just with anxiety, but what they had found was that people who had high anxiety tended to be more addicted to the internet. So what that means is that if we are able to mitigate that anxiety, there is less likelihood for internet addiction to occur in the first place. And as a framework for understanding these vulnerabilities, what we sort of also need to understand is that when people are interacting with the internet, it can activate different parts of the brain that act as like a stimulant. So this is not unlike caffeine, amphetamines, or cocaine for that matter. So it does stimulate the same parts of the brain. Also know that children with autism are often sensitive to stimulants of all kinds, whether it's pharmaceutical or electronic. So when they are interacting with something, it may be overstimulating, but it also may be truly fascinating for them. And that can also lead to overstimulation. And overstimulation is not necessarily a good thing at all. It is something that happens when people are extremely stimulated or in a place that is very uncomfortable for them. People with autism and attention issues may not be able to tolerate prescribed stimulants. This is also a standard treatment for ADHD. And stimulants tend to make children with autism irritable, over-focused, more obsessive compulsive, and unable to sleep. So we also want to make sure that they were mitigating some of those medicines. So I also want to say that we ourselves can have internet addiction. This is not necessarily something that is unique to the autistic population. And that there are people that can be obsessed with the internet because it's an escape. It's a reality that is controlled. It's something that that someone can interact with that is predictable, that is exciting, that can lead them to have a lot of clout in that reality. I know a lot of people who YouTubers may talk about this, where they're talking about the fact that they are really excited to be on YouTube because so many people like them, but in real life, they're not actually really liked with anyone. So I think that that is something really important and truly important for us to understand, that internet addiction happens to anyone, but the reason why it happens in autistic populations is because, one, it's a controlled environment, and two, it is that people have anxiety, so that kind of interaction could be more useful for them. And there are ways to mitigate this. So that's what we're talking about here. One, know their routine, know what that looks like, and make sure that they are able to stick to that routine. Be mindful of what causes them anxiety, and we will be talking about different ways that autistic populations interact with anxiety. Also, other tools of management. So this could be internal, external stimuli. External meaning fidget gadgets, fidget spinners. Those are really great to have something that they can grasp onto. Also, knowing their triggers could be a great internal mitigation, and also understand why they themselves may be absorbing this information. And to know why they are going through this. They may not be able to completely explain, or they may be able to explain, but having those sorts of conversations can be difficult, but can be very rewarding for us to understand what they're going through. I will be talking about anxiety and depression in autistic populations, because this is where the substance use disorder really does come in. And what we actually find is that diagnosed versus undiagnosed populations have a staggering difference when it comes to substance use disorder. And the reason why is that people who are diagnosed finally know why they feel that way. They finally know, they have a label, they understand, they're able to sort of grasp that reality. But people who are undiagnosed may live in the question mark, the nuance of the unknown. And that can be really scary for a lot of people, especially because they feel like there's something wrong with them. And that's just not true at all. But I know that there are people that, especially for people that just don't know what they are, who they are, things like that, labels can really help them grasp onto identities and sort of understand more about that part of their identity. So when people who are undiagnosed, these people actually have a very, very, very hard time navigating the world, because they don't have the words, the jargon, and the reality to understand what they're going through. So that is something that we should know as well. Also, it's not impossible to diagnose when it comes to depression and autism. I just want to make that clear, but it can be a little bit more difficult. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit. I do have a video that I want to show first before we get into the really nitty gritty parts and a lot of the statistics, just because I feel that he explains a lot of things well. And he actually talks about how he has autism, and how he actually had addiction to fentanyl because he got his wisdom teeth taken out and realized that every time he felt anxious, he needed another drug to help him navigate his reality through his ableist realities. So, and he dealt with a lot of ableism. So we'll be talking about that as well. And especially when you're dealing with uneasy situations, it can be difficult too. So we're going to be starting here. Here we go.
I was ashamed. Like that's what came up for me. Like anytime that I would have the thought in my head, I was like, I can't tell people because this is bad. This is not me. Like this is not who I am. This is a different Dylan. This Dylan is bad. And so I kind of was like, well, where do I go? And I can't go to a group. I can't sit in front of people. I'm on the spectrum. One, I'm anxious, and two, I don't really know how to communicate really well in this group of people who are very different than me. I don't really know their names. I don't know them. The first rule I gave everyone when they told me I had anxiety was, I will never do a group, and I still follow it today. So, all I can do is go to a therapist, which is good, but it doesn't solve everything because, you have to find, it's about specialization, and it's about what they know, and it's about all of that. And so, it's frustrating. I can't necessarily go and tell people about it because of that. And now I'm up here and I'm telling you about it. So for me, being at college, it's just a lot of people go out on the weekends and drink. Like, that's the thing. Like, and people say to me, like, this is how I relax, Dylan. This is how I feel better about my day. And I look at them and I go, I really wish I could feel better about my day too. And I don't tell them. And so it's this fear that's in the back of my head at all times. It's like, when does it happen? When does someone offer me something and I don't have that? I've had it twice in my life where I said no, and I had twice in my life where I keep doing it. Because I can tell you, I'm still constantly working and I'm still constantly on my computer. So when is the time that I don't say no, and then how do I stop it again? So it's really scary. I don't know. It's totally unknown to me. And that's the problem. Life is really long. And I'm 18. Guessing most of you in this room are going, wow, he's young. He is a whippersnapper, which is actually something I would say. So it seems like my life hasn't been super long. But I was born, and when you're diagnosed at 7 on the spectrum, like, you're in the middle, late range of diagnosis. So they're like, we want to get you to where you need to be right now. Like, you have to learn the social skills right now. And then people will understand you, they will like you, you will be able to do this, your life will be great. And it's not, because the day before, a week before I went off to college, I said to my therapist, I was like, I've gone to 6 schools. How do I know 7's going to work? And she was like, Dylan, I don't really think that this, like, the training is doing that much for you. Like, you can't learn more when everyone else around you can't give you the rest of, when you're offering 75%, they're only offering 25%, of course it's going to be really stressful. The problem is, if they don't know how to offer 50% and you do, then you're always going to have this disconnect. And so, I really do have this disconnect with people. I don't quite understand it. And I got all this training, and I walked through one fire. I really did. I learned, I got beaten up, I got multiple concussions. That's what happens when you play football without helmets at an all-boys school. I did. I walked through one fire, and I walked through a second one when I realized that I was coping through these very unhealthy means. And then I realized that I have to walk through another one in the way that I learned all of these skills, and now I have to unlearn them. I have to unlearn all of these skills because they're not, these are the things that in between the schools, that's what they were teaching me. They were saying, Dylan, if you did this, they'll like you more. And it doesn't matter, because they won't like me more because I learned some skill. Instead, it just makes me really dislike myself more. And so, when I go back to school, there'll be a lot of kids who say to me, Dylan, it's so amazing. You did another TED Talk. And I have people say, Dylan, it's amazing. You wrote a book. Dylan, it's amazing. You did a TED Talk before. Dylan, you do all this stuff. It's amazing. You must be so happy. I'm not. I'm really not. I'm not a happy person.
Okay, so I did kind of want to end it there because he does go on a little bit of a tangent, but this is a great resource, a very good TED Talk, and something that I think that a lot of people could benefit from viewing. And this video will be also listed in the description below. But he sort of talks about a lot of it, and he doesn't talk about a lot of his substance use disorder at the very end. And I did want to take out snippets, but it is just a very long video to put in here, but it is such a good video. So I highly suggest for anyone that could to watch it in its full capacity. So, but what he really does touch upon is that the reason why he started his addiction, and especially his addiction to fentanyl, is because, and fentanyl is a very, very intense pain management drug, is because it made him feel good. It sort of took a lot of the anxiety away. And that's something that can be really hard for people to understand, is that a lot of the time when you have people with autism spectrum disorder, this is a huge statistic here. I just thought it was staggering. 40% of people with autism spectrum disorder exhibit anxiety. And this means that they can exhibit anxiety in a lot of different aspects. So this could be a specific phobia, this could be social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, or separation anxiety. So those are all things that display themselves in the autistic population. And that is something that is a lot of concern for us to help mitigate a lot of those responses, because people that have anxiety search for things that can help them interact with their environments. And that is something that we, as people who help people navigate their environments, could really use some more education on. And also, I'm going to be going back to this. This is my trigger warning. This talks about mentions of abuse, but I do want to talk about it just because it is something that is really important, and it also adds to anxiety and depression. So this is a long article that I had been sifting through. It is it's very emotional to read. There are a lot of parts of it that were very difficult for me to get through while I was reading, but I've got some numbers alert, and we are just going to look through these as we go. Studies suggest that children on the spectrum are up to, excuse me, 3 times as likely as their neurotypical peers to be targets of bullying and physical or sexual abuse. Now, that means that 1 in 3, 3 times as likely as someone who is neurotypical, meaning anyone that does not have any sort of neurotypical tendencies. So anybody on the autism spectrum can is very vulnerable in that aspect. Also, McDonald, who is a researcher on autism spectrum disorder, she and her colleagues decided to investigate the link that tapped autism with some surveillance data and talk about some forms of abuse that had occurred. And they actually looked at records from South Carolina Department of Social Services, and they compared patterns of abuse and neglect up to, and I think it was around 5,000 children, and with and without autism born from 1992 to 1998. And what they had found is that 1 in 5, that's 20%, autistic children in the state, and 1 in 3 with both autism and intellectual disability have been reported to be maltreated. And maltreated in its own right is physical, sexual, emotional, bullying, all that stuff. So those are all forms of abuse there. And adults with autism spectrum disorder are thought to be disproportionate at risk of developing mental health disorders. And what can be interesting is that the reason why that we're looking at this, and the reason why we're looking at rates of abuse and things like that, is because some people on the autism spectrum are nonverbal and unable to talk for themselves, but that doesn't mean they don't know what's wrong. That doesn't mean they don't know what's going on. That doesn't mean that they are completely unaware of their surroundings. And to understand that rates of abuse happen because they are a vulnerable population is a truly important part for us to understand as well. That when we are interacting with people on the autism spectrum, we also need to understand that they are vulnerable and that they are more likely to have some sort of abuse or some sort of mental health disorder because of the things that they have to go through. And also, depression comes from many different places. And just to understand that there are evidence-based practices that are to treat and are still in development, and we will be alluding to those treatments later on. But I just wanted to reiterate that anxiety and depression come from a lot of different places, and that every single time and every single instance that are listed here is that, yes, it can come from within, but most of the time when people, especially people on the autism spectrum, have anxiety and depression is because of the way they interact with their environment, because other people, other things, and other places, and media in general have told them that they are weird, that they are not cool, that they're not interesting, that they're one way or this way. And that in itself can cause a lot of anxiety and depression. And also, that abuse does not happen because people ask for it. Abuse happens because people like to take advantage of vulnerable populations. So that is something to keep in mind as we move forward as well. All right, moving on. So we will be talking about ableism. If anybody has any questions about ableism, they can obviously put them in the chat. But while we are looking through ableism, I just want people to know that ableism comes in many forms, and there are a lot of different things to it. So ableism, so when we are talking about it, I kind of want to define it first, and then we're going to sort of look at some numbers here. When we're talking about ableism society, we don't, how does it affect people who have disabilities? Ableism technically is just defined as anything that is uh, sort of like, excuse me, all right, ableism, my bad, is talking about anything that affects people from who have disabilities. So any way in which they are no longer given access to people who have disabilities, and it sort of takes away from anyone that has those disabilities. So it also sort of is an overview, if you will, when we're talking about this, where it can be blatant, it can be every day, and it can be a microaggression. So I'm going to go back up to why it is important to acknowledge this first, and then we'll sort of get down to business on how we can break down ableism. So more than 1 billion people worldwide, around 15% of the population have some type of disability. This can be invisible or physical disability and anything in between. So disability is not just when it comes to people who have physical ailments or who physically display something. It can mean a lot of different things. It can mean people who have crippling anxiety or depression, or any other mental health disorder. A lot of those physical or invisible disabilities are there too. And people with disabilities, and let's make this clear, make up a quarter of the United States population, meaning that 1 in 4 people have some type of disability. So that doesn't mean that we are able to sort of look at someone and know whether or not they have a disability. So that is also something to keep in mind. And that is why it's important to acknowledge this, because there are so many people in our lives that experience ableism, and it comes in varying degrees. So it can be difficult for us to talk about. So when we're talking about blatant ableism, there may just be lack of compliance with disability rights laws. There may be segregating students with disabilities in separate schools, the use of restraints or seclusion as a means of controlling students with disabilities, segregating adults and children with disabilities into institutions, failing to incorporate accessibility into building design plans. So if you see, and they don't necessarily have a ramp so that people with wheelchairs or people with crutches or things like that aren't able to access the building, that could be blatant. Um, Building inaccessible websites. So for example, if you have a website that is really hard to navigate, or website that is extremely overstimulating, that could be ableism. The assumption that people with disabilities are people that need to be fixed. And I'm going to just look at our quote here for a second that says, for people without disabilities, technology makes things easier. For people with disabilities, it makes things possible, meaning that we are sort of looking at this thing where we say, technology makes people's lives easier. But when you have things that exist, a lot of those infomercials that talk about how people can open cans, and they sort of make everyday objects or everyday acts as part of like a joke sometimes on the internet, where they're like, why does this exist in the first place? And for some people, the everyday objects that are appliances that open things easier, or that exist in different ways to make people's lives easier, that's because people with invisible or physical disabilities are able to use those in a way that are different than how we use them. And that's really the reality there. Also, another way that is blatant ableism could be refusing to provide reasonable accommodations. Eugenics movement in the early 1900s, meaning that people who had autism or any sort of disability just, were a failure of, like a failure of humanity. Also, and the mass murder of disabled people in Nazi Germany, that is something to keep in mind as well, that people who had disabilities were physically murdered because of it. Everyday ableism, I actually have it up here. Look at the person when you're speaking to them, understanding that lack of eye contact is just a part of the autistic population, and it can happen, and not every person with autism has that struggle, but some people do. So just to keep that in mind. But everyday ableism maybe could be choosing an inaccessible event or venue for people that aren't able to go through. Framing disability as either tragic or inspirational in news stories, movies, and other popular forms of media. Casting a non-disabled actor for a disability role that plays, it could either be in a play, movie, TV show, or commercial. using the accessible bathroom stall when you're able to use the non-accessible bathroom stall without pain or risk of injury. So for example, if you're just someone that goes into the stall that is for people who may have a physical disability versus a stall that is just regular for people that anybody can use, you will be taking that space away from someone that really could need it if you don't need it. Talking to a person with a disability like they're a child and talking about them instead of directly to them, or you may be speaking for them and they don't necessarily want that. Asking invasive questions, assuming they have a visible disability, whether they may actually be disabled, questioning if someone is actually disabled or how much, and asking someone, how did you become disabled? Those are all things that exist under the everyday ableism. And we're going to be talking about microaggressions on the next slide, which is really just about how people choose words and how words matter. Also, I've heard a lot of people that are saying, why are you always looking at your phone? Why are you always, doing these sorts of things? Why are you? And then asking people how they're interacting with technology and saying, well, it's just this generation, Generation Z, the millennials, they just don't know how to interact with everyday life. Some people genuinely need technology in order to function on an everyday level. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they may be addicted to technology. It just may mean that they're having a hard time interacting socially. And that could be for a variant of reasons. And it is not anyone's place to judge how people interact with their environment. And to proceed with interactions without judgment could be really helpful as well. And I do want to say words very much do matter. And in that, how do words matter? In their own right, words are a direct translation of what people think in their head. And that is literally what it is. Our words are formed by how our brains thinks. And yes, this is exactly what they are supposed to be, but it's more than that, because the words that we choose are the implication of what we think about another person. And if we choose the wrong words or repeatedly use words that are wrong in the situation that we're in, that can be very damaging to the people listening to it. So why is this something that could be, words matter? Why do words matter? Ableism has already been discussed, but being sure to filter any responses that can hurt an individual is a big deal. So if someone says that's so lame, you're so, and then using the R word, you're acting bipolar today, you're crazy, are you off your meds? It's like the blind leading the blind. It's falling on deaf ears. She's such a psycho. I'm super OCD on how I clean my room. These are the sorts of things that it doesn't necessarily mean that we are using it in a way that is meant to hurt someone, but it does mean that we're using words in a way that can hurt somebody because of the way that they interact with their environment. So if someone really is bipolar, or someone really does have OCD, or someone really is on the autism spectrum, it's really not okay to use words that can disenfranchise that person's existence or add to the ability of them to internalize those negativities. So, that is something that is really, really important for people to understand. Also, I have talked a lot about this, and I have talked to a lot of people about this. First person, or person first versus identity first presentation. So there is a difference when you're talking about someone who is autistic person or a person with autism. There are people that refer differently to it. And honestly, I just ask the person what they prefer. I've met people that say, I would like to be considered an autistic person versus a person with autism, and vice versa. And really, it's just up to that person to decide. And really, what's the difference is that some people like to own the fact that they have autism or a disability, or, whatever it is, because it is something that is part of their identity. It is how they navigate the world. It is how they interact with their reality. So that's not something to be ashamed of. It's just something to let people know what they are. And for some people, they like to have their person first because they're a person first before they have an identity other than that. So it can really, lead to whatever it is, and just using what people prefer can really help that process. Also, understanding that special education, when people call it special education, that doesn't necessarily mean that other people are special, especially when we're talking about the autistic community, because when we're saying that someone is special, it means that they need extra stuff. But if we are providing information and resources and things already, that doesn't mean it's special. That just means it's part of the curriculum of that education system. So it's not special, It's just education, regardless of what that looks like, because we accommodate, we provide, we give those resources, and that's it. That's education in its own right. That's what it's supposed to be. Also, when we are using words that help people with self-perception, this can lead to inner wealth. That means that when you use the right words, when you use the right nuances, when you interact with their environment in the right way, when you talk to people like they want to be talked to, it really helps with their own perception of themselves. But if we use it the wrong way, if we use words that can really hurt them, that lead to their negative self-perception, it can also lead to substance use disorders because they are looking for ways to cope with their environment. Once again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. All right, so I get this question a lot, and I sort of want to understand that we're closing out this presentation. I only have a couple more slides, but if we're closing out this presentation, how can we help? And I'm going to be playing this video, but before then, I think that children all learn the different nuances of what it means to grow up. But at the same time, I think it's also important to note that social interactions and trying to figure out new ways and different ways to engage with the autistic community can be truly important for them and great for their development to understand that they are not alone, that they are not weird, they are not different, they are just who they are. And finding physicians and diagnoses that fit the individual well. So if someone is on the autism spectrum disorder, understanding what type of autism they have. Also not expecting the child to fit around societal expectations. A lot of the time when we sort of mold people to fit societal expectations, it tends to backfire and it hurts the child more than it helps them. As long as we're able to give them the resources and help them function to the best of their ability, that's all we can do, and hope that they can build their own inner wealth that way. Also, this is a great resource. This is neurodiverse counseling in general. So this is a great resource for people who are neurodivergent and they are looking for specific accommodations for their situation. I think it's a really important part of that as well. And I will be playing this and then we'll go back to the other stuff after. Here we go.
Them stretch a little bit in the virtual world, I think is
Give me a second. I just want to make sure I get that statistic in there. All right, here we go. One more time.
to be able to put them in a safe environment and let them stretch a little bit in the virtual world, I think is a significant safety net that we can use here at Imagine and have a conversation before actually being in the environment alone.
It's not a cure for addiction, but I believe it's going to be an effective tool to help us design therapies that are more effective for long-term change.
Whether it's substance abuse or whether it's eating disorder or it's anxiety or mental health, is so relatable.
My youngest daughter has dyslexia, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder. And she was in the lab and we put her in one of the virtual worlds because she wanted to try it. And I watched her behavior and was really noticing how she interacted in the scene. Then I began thinking, how do we leverage what we're doing to create environments to teach children and adults with autism communication, social skills, navigating their environment? People talk about a light bulb moment. It was like, whoa, if I understood what my daughter was experiencing to help me to have better interactions with her, that would mean the world to me, because I don't know what she experiences. But that really drives me. I'm privileged, I love my job, I enjoy working with technology, but the long-term goal is to empower people for long-term change in their lives.
So I did want to play this just because it is something that is really important for us to know, to understand, to realize, but also to know that when we are looking at different forms of therapy, there are so many different parts of therapy that exist, meaning that this is a new development, meaning that it is something that is now being offered for people who are in the autistic population, that they are able to interact with their environments in a controlled environment, to understand social interaction in a controlled environment, to help with their substance use disorder in a controlled environment. These are the types of things that are really coming out and that give us a lot of hope in understanding how we can help children interact, how we can help children deal with their mental health disorders. These are all sorts of things that, people should search for, people should look for, people should understand when they are interacting with people of any sort of neurodivergency. Also, the best way we can also help is fighting against ableism. So in times where we hear people saying something that could be ableist, we want them to know that that's not, something that's okay. That's not something that helps people. That's not something that adds to this discourse or the conversation of people fighting for disability rights. And the fact is that when we are able to fight against ableism, we're able to help people be informed about what that means. We are able to give people vocabulary, able to give people resources and information that really helps them interact with different neurodivergent populations. Also, understanding what is normal and what is abnormal for the child, not specifically in general, but for the child. Is it abnormal for them to stay on for 6 hours at a time in front of a computer? Is it normal for them to do so? These are the sorts of things that could be monitored, mitigated, and understood. And the fact is that therapy in itself can be traumatizing if it is not the right kind of therapy, especially because it can sort of act like as a gaslighting to a lot of autistic populations if it's done aggressively. Especially there were some instances where people said, they were forced to look at people in the eye, where they forced their eyes open to look at different people in the eye during these forms of therapy. And that's not necessarily the most conducive way to give people empowerment, to give people, the ability to want to advocate for themselves. That's not the way to do that. So finding therapies that really work for autistic populations is a huge part of this discourse. So, all right. And we are going to be closing on two quotes that I really enjoy. I actually found them both quite nice. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. And that really can be true for any part of life, but for us to understand that people are on spectrums and that life is not absolute, and that autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum, meaning that there are different variants of it. And I also have the quote saying, not being able to speak is not the same as not having anything to say. And to understand there are nonverbal populations on the autism spectrum disorder, and to understand that on one hand, the media turns people into heroes, into geniuses, into inspiration. It can infantilize, placate, or diminish the autonomy of any human with autism. And it's a job of people who act as allies, who help people seek treatment, to help those who want to get better, to understand that autism is a spectrum and to accommodate those needs as it sees fit. So for what works for one population may not work for another, what works for one person may not work for another, and to understand that we ourselves could help mitigate that through trial and error. And we could be doing the world of service for the autistic population if we give them a platform, we empower them for them to speak for themselves, to advocate for themselves, and to not act as saviors, but to act as allies in helping lift them and using their voices to help further their own population and their own environments and their own resources and their own experiences. So that is all I have to say. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your efforts. I really appreciate everything that is here and everyone that is here. And hope to see you next week. Next time, we will be talking about mental health disorders because May is Mental Health Month. So thank you so much.